So my name is Aaron. I go by Torch2424 on the internet. I made that name when I was 6, and I've just always kept it. That's why it doesn't make any sense. But what I do in open source mostly is work on a project called AssemblyScript. It's a TypeScript-like language, so like huge emphasis on the TypeScript-like. It looks and feels like TypeScript, but what it does is it compiles to WebAssembly, which is a new binary format for code you can run in the browser, on the web, and things. And it's going all types of interesting places, just Internet of Things and like server-side applications and so on and so forth. But essentially, it's a portable binary format. And I could ramble on about so many things already. And I probably should also mention I work at Fastly doing working on the WebAssembly team, just kind of like pushing WebAssembly out to the ecosystem and just working on this new serverless product thing we're working on. So yeah.
I guess we can start with like what are use cases for WebAssembly, and like why would you even reach for this?
Yeah, totally. So probably the biggest use case is, just to boil it really down, is that essentially it depends on, so WebAssembly can do a lot of different things. That's why I'm kind of like hesitating here.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you're coming from. So I like to explain it in the context of like, let's say you're a front-end developer, you write a lot of JavaScript on the web and things like that. What WebAssembly fits in for you is that JavaScript is interpreted. It's kind of slow because you have to run it in a just-in-time compiled runtime like V8, and it needs to be compiled over and over. And essentially it makes assumptions about your code. When those assumptions go wrong, your code gets really slow because it has to go and kind of like relearn what's going on. Whereas WebAssembly, it's a bytecode. So it's just compiled straight down to like machine code essentially and run in a VM. So there is no like, oh, let me just figure out what this WebAssembly is doing. It's just fast from the beginning. Yeah. So you get that predictable performance. And that's really like the huge point here is predictable performance, so that you can kind of like, you don't have to, it's really good for things like games because we need that predictable performance. We can't just like, be doing bullet physics and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, sorry, we made a wrong assumption about where this bullet was going. Let's just slow down the whole game. Sorry.
Are there already any games that are using this?
Ooh, that's a good question. I know. So I actually have a website called Made with WebAssembly that I help maintain. I don't know if you want. Yeah.
WebAssembly. Let's check it out.
Yeah.
Which is very useful.
Yeah. So you can see in the top, you can type games and then we can look at a bunch of games. WebAssembly.
Perfect.
So I don't know why some of the icons broke recently, but you can see things like RenPy Wasm is a project of mine, but we can get into that later. Unity, duh. So Unity is a super popular game engine, and they have a web export, and it used to export this thing called AssemblyJS, which was like kind of a precursor to WebAssembly.
Yeah.
Essentially, it would do things like force. Since JavaScript is dynamically typed, it would do things like, oh, it's or on an integer there to like force V8 to know, oh, this is going to be an integer because it just has to be. But now that we have WebAssembly, we don't have to make these assumptions or play around with dynamic types. They're all statically typed. So we can make faster assumptions when we compile at compile time. So Unity pretty much is a long way to say Unity switched from AssemblyJS to WebAssembly. And now when you export for the web with Unity, it uses WebAssembly. So
yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. Can we talk about Wasm?
Yeah, totally. So using this website's kind of complicated, but essentially the way I got into WebAssembly is that I think it went stable in all, I guess, committed in all browsers around 2018. And then like right when it hit all browsers, it's like, oh no, I'm already late. This technology is proven. It's in all browsers. I got to build something today. So I was still a senior in college, and like, it was just kind of funny because I had this like weird schedule where I could work at like 3 a.m. and like not have to go for class because I had all night classes. Anyways, I just started working on a game, an emulator in my free time that I wanted to like run on the web. And then it ended up working out. And essentially this is just a Game Boy emulator that I built I don't work on it as much just because I've been quite busy lately. But yeah, if you go to just, I guess, to show it off, if you go to open on the top left, and then you go to open source ROMs, so there's all the like games that are open source, and you can click the first one, let's say.
Yep.
And then if you click play and playback controls, I know this is like the most unintuitive, but it's meant for debugging. Yeah. So just to like show that off, if you go to widgets in the top left as well, and let's go to CPU, for example, and then you can go to just state, and you can see it. You can move around the tabs and stuff anyways, but essentially it'll show you what's going on in the CPU. So essentially it's an emulator. So it's really emulating what the chips do on the Game Boy, how the electricity runs through the system and everything. And you can see how it's executing through the program counter. It's very low level, but
So this is like, would this be something if someone wanted to like build their own ROMs or develop for games today? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of the debugger here. So if you, for example, wanted to build an actual Game Boy game, instead of like downloading another emulator, you could just use this one in the web and just upload the ROM over and over and see like how your program's executing and everything.
Oh, that's amazing. That's pretty awesome. I have to ask, have you built any games, or is this more of you just sort of testing it out?
So I built a demo once. I wanted to make like a Super Smash Brothers type game for Game Boy, and I had it all planned out, and then I just never got the time. I got to the level point where I could jump, and then I was like, okay, this is too much work.
Yeah, I mean, I've never done any game development, but I know it's a lot of work. That's why I work on the web instead. Yeah, that's pretty legit, and pretty cool example too as well. And like the shout out to the fact that this is open source. Folks, drop a star over there, show some love on some WasmBoy for sure.
Yeah. So that's probably the most like flashy demo I have of WebAssembly. That being said, I could go through this real quick. I have like a little article that someone wrote.
Okay. I'll switch over to your screen.
Cool. So yeah, let me zoom in. Boom, boom, boom. Cool. So this is an article by Marcel Dwin. Essentially, a lot of the times you get the question of like, okay, WebAssembly, that's cool. You have an emulator going, but like, who's using it in production? And this is a great example, I think. Essentially, they work on micro storytelling. Essentially, it's like a little tool where you can like do visual storytelling and things on the web, which is like really cool. And it's like a whole little storyboarding thing. But essentially, they have a story about how they used to only use JavaScript in the browser to do all their rendering. And I'll just scroll down here real quick to show like the flashy stuff. Essentially, they pretty much took a lot of that JavaScript code and they converted it to the AssemblyScript language I was talking about, the TypeScript-like language. And they got some really cool benefits from it. And let me see if I can find the numbers. I don't want to like just make up numbers because then I'd feel bad after. It's a long article. So if you're interested in WebAssembly, this is like, especially if you want to use it in production, this is like the article to read. Okay. But for example, something like this, you'll see that like for right here, they're talking about like originally on the left-hand side, like when they used JavaScript and 3JS and things, and they switched over to their new renderer they had pre-written in AssemblyScript, that their bundle size essentially like almost cut in half by just, instead of replacing all that like extra JavaScript code with a WebAssembly module, which is really cool. They did a bunch of other benchmarks here, and you'll see here that like they're using way less CPU cycles, which is cool because now for example, if you were on your phone, let's say if your application was mobile, then like now you're just using way less battery, you're using a lot less CPU cycles. It's going to feel more snappy and smooth. And all in all, I think it's just really cool to see stuff like this because I don't know about you, but when I was first learning JavaScript, I eventually hit that point where I was like, I want to build a video editor in the browser. And then I realized, oh, that just won't work because like, this is not how the technology works in the browser. But now with WebAssembly, we can do things like these high performance, like really like wild, you would expect to run in C type applications, but in the web, which is really cool. And I guess right here, 65% less CPU used. So like just, all the CPU cycles are used way more efficiently and they got a lot of performance benefits out of it. So, I don't know. I can't talk this article up enough because when I first saw it, I was like, yes. Yeah, definitely. I think this is probably the best example to show right here. So essentially what I tell people is AssemblyScript is what I mean by TypeScript like is that if you can read and understand TypeScript and write TypeScript, you can pretty much use AssemblyScript for the most part. The differences where it comes in is because, again, we have the static typing and things. Essentially, what AssemblyScript does is take TypeScript and just add the little like extra flares that WebAssembly needs to be compiled to. So for example, here, normally you would write like, okay, this parameter right here, this would be a number. But because WebAssembly has that static typing, you need to say, this is a number that's an integer of 32 bits. And that's, like we have to be more specific with our typing. And when you do that to your TypeScript using AssemblyScript, you can then compile to WebAssembly and reap those benefits that WebAssembly offers. You know what I mean? Yeah. And again, like I want to say it's so TypeScript-like because a lot of the project is very grassroots. Like I started off with just the author that wrote it. And then I started building the WasmBoy thing. And then I started helping out with issues and things and eventually compiling, or I do a few contributions to compiler here and there, but mostly like libraries and things of that sort. And then another person came along and now it's grown into like a really large community.
Choose AssemblyScript over TypeScript then at that point?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that because I have a WebAssembly versus ES6. So this is a benchmark I wrote with WasmBoy way back, not way back, I guess. Was it 2018? I guess
it feels like way back.
Yeah, in web years, that's way back.
Yeah, we've had so many frameworks since then.
Yeah, but essentially what I did is I took my emulator, and again, I mentioned that since they're so similar, we can use the same source code for the emulator and compile it with the TypeScript compiler to JavaScript, and then compile it with the AssemblyScript compiler to WebAssembly, and then compare the two. And then I have a bunch of graphs here and stuff. But what you'll mostly notice is that essentially you get about, at least in my use case, it's going to be different for every use case, but I saw about like a 30% increase in terms of performance, just in general, like how many frames can I run in a time span on desktop. But what gets really interesting is, just for me, I'm really big into like mobile, like, you know, low end device usage. You start to see like a way bigger performance delta. And usually that, I guess, like you see about a 60% increase in performance. So as the hardware gets slower and slower, the more that WebAssembly, I've noticed, starts to help out in these like real world type use cases when you're building games and things of that sort. So I know these numbers might seem a lot bigger. I forgot if these numbers are big. So there is, oh yeah. Well, no, this is true then. Okay, cool. My bad. 2.59 times as fast. There was a bug with Firefox, and that was really cool too. Building this project, I found I found a bug in every browser in like their WebAssembly implementation, which is like kind of funny to say.
Yeah, that's just some other popular use cases.
Yeah. So I guess another really popular use case that we're seeing a lot is serverless. Kind of, you know, I guess I almost alluded to it with the JavaScript inside of WebAssembly thing, but this idea of sandboxing untrusted code is essentially what serverless does at scale, you know, on a server somewhere for you. So because of that, we're starting to see a lot of like companies popping up with like serverless solutions that are really powered by WebAssembly because of their security benefits, such as like their capability-based security model, where WebAssembly can only really do what you give it access to. That linear memory, again, that's really great because you don't want people escalating out, touching other people's memory, if your runtime supports that and things of that sort. So yeah, I would see serverless as a big one. Gaming. I think another good use case I could think of off the top of my head is Figma, which is a popular design tool. They do a lot of their rendering in WebAssembly.
Interesting.
So yeah, a lot of like, I guess, browser applications. And maybe one last thing, just 'cause I'm rambling so hard right now, I'm sorry, but
no, this is all interesting because I did not know all this information.
Cool. Another big one I think is kind of the idea of containerization. I don't know if you saw the tweet from Solomon Hykes. It's kind of like famous or infamous. I don't know how to use that word, but they pretty much said like if WASM and WASI is the WebAssembly system interface, it's kind of like Node for WebAssembly. Like you can access file system and stuff. It's terrible generalization, but you know, for JavaScript people, but it makes sense to us, I think. But if they existed back in 2008, they wouldn't have built Docker because they could have just used WebAssembly with security benefits, plus that like those capabilities that WASI would provide to do what Docker does, like this idea of containerization of like code and things of that sort. So we're starting to see a lot of movement in that space and open source projects that are kind of like, hey, instead of like, you know, using a whole container with all the OS primitives, we could just use a WebAssembly runtime. It would be way lighter, and we can start to containerize our code and things of that sort using WebAssembly. It doesn't completely replace containers, but like there is a world where like WebAssembly containers make sense.
So I want to circle back into AssemblyScript and talk more about that project and sort of how it's set up and how like what are we looking at in the forward? Like what are the things that AssemblyScript is looking to accomplish?
Yeah, in terms of like high level roadmap goals or like what's next on our roadmap, things of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned so AssemblyScript. It's not backed by any sort of company. It has an open collective, so you guys have a some sort of core team, I imagine. That has thoughts and ideas. So like, who's part of the core team? Who's driving the roadmap, and like, what are the things that we should be looking out for to be able to try?
Cool. So yeah, we do have a core team. We have a repo called Core. You know, and I'm on the core team, but we have a list of people. So right now, like pretty much we have a core team, but more rather than like, you know, say these are the 3 people you should talk to. We just would rather be like, hey, look, depending on what you want to do or like what you're interested in, these are the folks that are most active in the project. So we're all part of the core team, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is pretty much the core team here. Like Daniel is the author. Max is like, Daniel and Max are pretty much like the co-partners on like building the actual compiler. I do a lot of like outreach, libraries, buildings and stuff. Joshua Tenner wrote an amazing just like testing library that like anyone using AssemblyScript in production pretty much uses. So that's like really cool. And a bunch of other folks here. I don't want to name, you know, sit here for like 10 minutes. Just, oh yeah, this guy built this. This person built this. But
this is good to know too as well. And I don't know if a lot of other projects have like a core repo. But yeah, this is super useful.
I actually took notes. So another thing about me is I used to work on the AMP team at Google, and honestly, I learned a lot from just working on like a larger open source project from Google. And I was like, okay, that's so they have a similar thing where they have a core repo, and I was like, that was a good idea. Let me bring this over to AssemblyScript.
Yeah.
But what was I going to say about this? But you asked about our roadmap and things. So personally, I think we all honestly have different, goals and things, but I think the big one we've all kind of like agreed upon is the next or like the last big thing that we need for the compiler is closures. So the idea of like passing functions around is kind of like fundamental to like how an advanced JavaScript developer writes their JavaScript applications. So it's one like our last big sticking point is that we're missing that because writing compilers is hard. But I think that's the last one. And then after that, I think we might start considering things like 1.0ing the project and things of that sort. The other last sticking point was regex. Whoa. But that was written by Colin. They built an AssemblyScript regex library, which isn't like fully fleshed out, but people are using it and it's working for them. So we're like, all right, cool. We'll like check that one off the box. You know what I mean? In the meantime. But yeah, does that answer the question? I think closures is probably like the biggest thing that.
Yeah, that's good to know. And yeah, I was going to catch up on like things that are missing too as well. But so I'm curious, how would folks, if they're interested in you getting started with WebAssembly, maybe want to build a project, like what would your recommendation be?
Oh yeah. So another website I maintain is WASM by example. Okay. So what this is essentially it's like a very hand-holdy. I don't know if you're familiar with Go by example.
Yes.
So it's like Go by example, where it's a lot of bite-sized examples. This one I will admit is a little bit more hand-holdy, a little bit more tutorial style, but it does have a lot of copy-pastable snippets for sure. So for example, here we're talking about the whole concept of linear memory. And one other thing, I'll take a step back real quick. There's a language, so you can choose what language you're comfortable in and do these examples, which is like I'm pretty stoked on. And then we also try to do some translations. I think we only have Rust translated to Portuguese, but someone was like, hey, I know Portuguese, I'll translate this. And I was like,
okay,
oh yeah, thank you. But we'll do AssemblyScript here just because I'm on the core team there. It's easiest for me. But for example, here, we'll say like, let's say we want to play with linear memory. This is all using pointers just because I wanted to show the concept of like, here's how you pass things between that JavaScript and WebAssembly boundary and the browser. So yeah, pretty much it's like, I have a bunch of commented code here saying this is what this does, this is what that's doing. Let's compile using the compiler and things of that sort, so on and so forth, words about WebAssembly and stuff. So I would definitely go through here. It's been funny too, because it's been really like Inception, because I've been doing like interviews with people now and they're like, oh yeah, I learned about WebAssembly from WASM by example. And I'm like, what? I'm like, no, I don't. It's whoa. Yeah. I built that. They're like, yeah, we know you built that. I'm like, no way.
So it's amazing when people use the things you build.
Yeah. But yeah, so pretty much this will show you how to like get started with WebAssembly in the browser. Again, there's lots of folks that want to use it for serverless and things. That knowledge still transfers over. And this does start off a little bit more low level, but it eventually shows how to do like more of the high level stuff. Cause again, not everyone wants to use pointers for like their stuff. So like there's, how to do like passing high level types and stuff and classes, and kind of the introduction to that WASI thing I was talking about, that kind of node for WebAssembly, that like kind of server side usage, how to get started there. So yeah, I think this is, multiple people have told me like, yeah, I like started here and like now I'm doing WebAssembly professionally and stuff. I mean, not that like this is a professional guy, but this is a starting point. Yeah. I verified, I have proof someone learned from this point. Yeah. You know what I mean? So yeah, I would start with WASM by example. Or let's say you're like a really big Rust fan. Rust has amazing WebAssembly documentation. You could start there as well if you want to start from that perspective rather than like the front end browser person perspective.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that helps. I don't know if that.
Yeah,
I could ramble forever.
Yeah, these this is great too as well, because you're giving us a lot of context and a lot of content for folks to sort of jump in and get started. I'm curious though about the adoption. So you had mentioned the Bytecode Alliance.
Yeah,
and all those folks on the list, they're all notable companies that we've heard of. But I'm curious about adoption. Where do you see we're on the trajectory of the adoption curve when it comes to WebAssembly? So like, I get that Firefox is leveraging it, and Fastly and Cloudflare and all these other companies are using it for these really intense use cases. But when do you think WebAssembly is going to become like a normal thing that people will pick up and grab?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned this. So I think it depends. If I could crystal ball a little bit, I think we're going to see a lot of WebAssembly usage first in the serverless space.
Yeah.
Just because that's where like a lot of like folks are investing the most time into. And I think the browser will probably end up like really exploding once more people get comfortable with it. Once things like AssemblyScript get a lot, or even just if, as more tooling comes out for JavaScript developers to like really pick it up and play with it, or AssemblyScript, implements different things. But at the end of the day, I think what's going to be most interesting is WebAssembly is going to be one of those like behind the scenes types things. So one thing about it being a module is that it's really easy to package to an NPM module, for example. So you can go ahead and upload WebAssembly to like NPM, for example, and then just wrap in a little bit of JavaScript shim type thing and you use it in the background. So like, for example, Unity, for example, we already talked about is using WebAssembly in the background. There's a lot of like JS game engines that are now implementing WebAssembly in the background. So you could be using WebAssembly and not even know it at some point. So I think I guess maybe the end goal will be not, the industry end goal, but in my personal opinion, what I think will happen is that WebAssembly for JavaScript developers will probably sit more in the background and some of the folks that like really want to use it. But I would like to, like my personal desire for the world would be cool of like, we all start learning the web with HTML, CSS, then we get to JavaScript. And then once you get those three nailed down, then I think WebAssembly would be like, okay, what's the last key I need to like go build that video editor now that I'm like feeling really comfortable with my developer skills.
Yeah, it's just like one level deeper into having access, but also performance that you can unlock with like a regular JavaScript runtime. Which I want to ask, like, are there WebAssembly runtimes? Like you mentioned in passing about that. So like I could use, actually, are there any examples out there?
Yeah, so probably the one I would most suggest is called WasmTime. It's built, kind of like sponsored by the Bytecode Alliance and things. Or is sponsor the right word? Bytecode Alliance does stuff with it. It's has a runtime there and you can download it and like run different WebAssembly modules. But what's cool about WasmTime too is that, let's say, again, we're building some like application, maybe like a web browser, maybe like a video game itself, and we want to provide like a scripting tool. What people oftentimes will do is take WasmTime, embed it in their like Rust or Python or Go projects, and then allow their users to submit, or maybe their community to submit WebAssembly modules, and then they can run them in WasmTime and then interface with the results they give. So for example, let me think of a good one. Like for example, a lot of smart contract folks, you're using things like WasmTime to go ahead and execute their smart contracts. And then they pretty much run whatever the smart contract is as a WebAssembly module, get the result that like it just outputs, and then they can like do whatever they want to do in their larger application. So yeah. Does that make sense? I know it's hard. I need a whiteboard to explain it better.
Yeah, it makes sense to me because like the example I have and the example I use to experiment with different JavaScript runtimes is the tool we're using right now to stream this to Twitch. It's called OBS, and OBS uses the regular browser runtime for Node, which is, I forget whatever the basic one, V8. It uses that, and I can interface with it as if I'm using it on my terminal or if I'm using it in Chrome. But the problem with that is I'm shipping this up and shipping at this point, what's the numbers? 3,300 kilobits per second for the stream, so that way our faces are not choppy and we're not dropping frames. But would be really nice if I can get this down to like 0% CPU usage and still have the animations and go like between here to here to back to here. Well, I meant to put back to your screen, but what I'm getting at is like that takes some power. And like my setup is pretty simple, but it's pretty simple because I know if it gets more intense, I could drop frames. So with that being said, like I would love to see like an OBS implementation that uses like WasmTime or all these other brand new JavaScript runtimes, so that way I can ensure me streaming to the internet is as fast as possible and perhaps even containerized enough that I don't have to worry about, again, dropping frames.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what you identified for sure was a good example of where you should try WebAssembly, and like whether it be work or personal project and things, is that like JavaScript's just slightly too slow here. Let me try to add WebAssembly, see if that like gets me over the performance hump that I need to do my thing. So yeah, but to your point as well, WebAS has a scripting language inside of it, so you can do custom like plugins and things. Right now it's in JavaScript, but if they were to use something like WasmTime, I don't want to like just be like, OBS, you need to go do this live on Twitch. You know what I mean? Like we're just brainstorming here. They could, possibly do something like WasmTime, and then you could write a WebAssembly module in like Rust, AssemblyScript, whatever you want to do, and just load that into OBS, and then ideally you would get all the benefits from WebAssembly compared to using something like a JavaScript engine. So yeah.
Yeah, and like I mentioned that example a lot because it is a pain point for me when I do streaming.
Mm-hmm.
I've had to upgrade my computer, get a graphics card, and all of this stuff because I need to make sure I can do this. But it'd be great if I could this stream from Twitch from my Mac laptop without the extra cables and wires and stuff like that is needed to make sure nothing goes down live on air, which has happened on occasion. But yeah, I think that's amazing. I think of the folks that are working at companies and looking for the next level things. I know you mentioned video streaming is something that kind of really took off a lot this year. And we're seeing more and more tools and folks trying to get, lossless compression and stuff like that for your live events. We saw Hopin acquired StreamYard being a tool to stream. Like that's all stuff that's all built in the browser and like using WebRTC. So like, are there any WebAssembly examples of like WebRTC and like crossing the streams that way?
Yeah. So if you ever use Zoom, in the browser, that uses WebAssembly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So exactly. Another thing where it's just like WebAssembly, I think will eventually be this thing that just kind of powers the web, but like no one really knows it unless like you're in the scene. So as it grows, it'll become more apparent, but like, yeah, Zoom for web uses WebAssembly. They, if I'm not mistaken, they have an scripting code base and they just compiled that C++ code base to the web. And that's how they do all their like decoding stuff or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm sure I could find an article about it, but I don't know if y'all want to watch me furiously Google for the next 5 minutes.
I mean, I think people are Googling right now as we speak. They're watching. Cool. But it's mind boggling too as well. And as you explain WebAssembly sort of doing the work in the background and not sort of like trying to teach you how to write some sort of syntax or a new language or a new library and frameworks. I think it's something that also introduced me to Rust early on back in like, again, around the time I learned about WebAssembly. My intro to Rust was when I was writing Ruby code. And the first thing I ever learned how to build was create a Ruby gem using Rust.
Yeah.
So like with Ruby, a lot of people have problems with Ruby and like maybe it's too slow or doesn't do what they want it to do. And Rust was a way to build a Ruby gem build it in Rust code and then have that point to the Ruby gems file in the libraries. And I thought that was like mind boggling that you could sort of inject whole another language inside of the language that you're normally writing. So it sounds like WebAssembly could do something very similar, especially like your Zoom example, being able to have like WebRTC in the browser and actually leverage bytecode as opposed to JavaScript runtimes and stuff like that. So absolutely fascinating. I'm definitely going to be going through that made with Wasm example and just like going through that. I think it's at this point a couple 125 projects. So yeah, gonna definitely check that out. Anything else you want to touch or cover on WebAssembly?
I think we did a pretty good round of the rounds.
Yeah. It was it was quite a tour for sure.
Yeah. Actually, can I just throw some resources out there if you don't mind?
Go for it.
So another thing is since there's talks and things, I assume since you're watching a Twitch stream, you probably like watching talks and things as well. There's a lot of great YouTube content. So WebAssembly Summit is a conference I help run with Surma, Devrel from Google, like Das Surma, I think on Twitter. But there's a lot of great content here as well. I would say there's a lot of great speakers here. This one's like from Brian Vibber. Another great use case is so they work at Wikimedia. Essentially, they needed to write like an open source decoding thing, and they couldn't use like MP4 video for like copyright reasons. So they ended up writing their own decoder in WebAssembly as their video player, and it worked out great for them because again, like JavaScript, they even showed some examples in JavaScript. It was just kind of too slow the way it was like processing the frame. So switch to WebAssembly with like threads and things. It was just like boom, just a good video player. So the idea here would be like future polyfilling using WebAssembly, which I think is another like kind of unspoken thing on the browser. Or not really unspoken, but that was highlighted.
Yeah.
And another great channel is so this is funny. Google thinks this Google Earth video is about the flat Earth. Like it's just a funny. I don't know why, but WebAssembly SF is another great resource. That's where we met at that one event. But they've had so many events now and they've recorded all the talks that there's some really great use cases here. Google Earth really highlighted again that code portability that like multiple languages compile to WebAssembly. They have one C code base for all like the Google Earth stuff, and they compile it to Android, iOS, and the web. So they just choose the target they want to compile to, and that way they can have one code base, but then compile to multiple platforms. And then WebAssembly is kind of what powers the web version these days.
Okay, cool.
using the same code base. So that's another thing. Maybe I'm glad we brought it up because now I can talk about code portability. And then I think those are the other two things. Oh yeah, again, just those two channels. So yeah, cool. I think those are the last points I can think of right now.
Tolka, I guess if I got that, Tolka mentioned web components is actually now powered by WebAssembly.
Oh wow.
Yes, I believe that web components. That's specifically the Google project, which I assume that's what you're referring to with the capital semantics. But yeah, so good shout out there as well. Yeah, it seems like WebAssembly is kind of sliding in a lot of different places. We've come a long way from just sort of having lots of talks and presentations on how cool it is to now it's actually being implemented in quite a few different places. It makes me want to pick up AssemblyScript and sort of kick the tires a bit and see how I can benefit some of my projects using some WebAssembly for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And to your point, I didn't want to, since we're just here chatting, if OBS is using V8, you should, in theory, be able to load WebAssembly in there. What you could do, even if it doesn't allow you to load multiple files, and you're not supposed to do this, but you can technically base64 encode a WebAssembly module, decode it in JS real quick, and then try to kick it over and see if OBS will let you run some WASM. Depending on the V8 version, it might not, but like if it's a newer V8, you might be able to get away with it if you want to do that as your beginner WASM project.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for whatever reason, OBS is a project I've reached out to a couple times, and I would love to have them on and chat and like explain how things are set up and how I can even compile the thing. But yeah, I guess I should probably just start kicking the tires and open up a PR if I can get it to work. It might be a couple weekends before I get something working. But yeah, great point. And I would love to have, honestly, if there's like a lighter version of OBS, I would love that. So I think StreamYard does a great job of building on top of some of these technologies and gives me a lighter version of it. I'd love to have that, but open sourced. That would be amazing.
Definitely.
Aaron, thanks so much for chatting about WASM, WebAssembly, AssemblyScript, all the above, Game Boy emulation.
Totally. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's always fun hanging out, and yeah, cool.